Shalom. Good morning. My name is Ambriette. Um, Recently, we just started a new Torah cycle, which is the annual reading of the Torah portions, starting in Genesis and ending in Deuteronomy. And I started doing this in 2012. So this marks, what would this be, my 7th year anniversary of going through the Torah cycle. And one thing that never ceases to amaze me is how every single year, even though I read the same scripture every year, I find something new. These little treasures, these little tidbits, it feels like something I've never read before. And so the Father never ceases to amaze me in that. Cycles are typical in scripture. Hebrew thought and time is in a cycle. It's not linear like Western cultures that we're used to. And so this has been a really cool learning experience for me. And because I learn something new every year, I thought it would be really nice for me to just record some of my thoughts and observations from this year. And so, like I said, we just started the new Torah cycle. And so we just read the portion of Bereshit, which is the creation account. And the scriptures that I'm using to read through the Torah portion is my GPS Hebrew English Tanakh, and so it's interlinear. What you see is the Hebrew next to the English text. And for the New Covenant readings, I use the Aramaic English New Testament. So I want to give a disclaimer. I'm not a Torah teacher by any sense of the word. I learn from people, so I listen to Rico Cortez a lot, Brad Scott, Bill Cloud, Monty Judah, and so on and so forth. And I read a lot of the resources that those teachers recommend. But I'm not here to provide some ground truth interpretation. I'm just sharing my thoughts. So you can agree or disagree, but what you should do is not take my word for it and read the scripture for yourself and study it and see what you come up with. And feel free to share your revelations with me. That's the great thing about scripture. There's not just one sole meaning to some piece of scripture. There are deeper and deeper meanings and deeper implications that can be found. And so I want to start just with an interesting observation. I don't know what this means. I'm sure it's significant in some way. And this is in Genesis chapter 1, so the very first chapter, verse 22. We'll start at verse 21 just to give some context. It said, God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and increase. Fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds increase on earth. And when I first read this, it struck me because I hadn't actually noticed this before, where he's giving this command to be fertile and increase to the beasts of the field, the fish, the birds, and I had recognized this command, but I remembered it only in the context of when he created man and woman. And so if you go down a couple of verses to verse 28, we'll start at verse 27. It says, and God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase. Fill the earth and master it. And so I found that an interesting parallel. The commandment to be fertile and increase actually wasn't given first and only to man, as I had thought. Before. It was actually given to the other created beings. And so, again, I don't know what that means. I don't know what the interpretation would be. Maybe that's a revelation for the next Torah cycle. Next year, we'll see. But now I want to move on. And so this is the story of the sin of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is one that I think we've all heard since we were kids. Probably learned it in church or Sunday school or Sabbath school or whatever. But I noticed something, again, that I'd never noticed before. So I want to go to chapter 2 and start reading at verse 16, which says, and Yahweh Elohim commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, But as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. And the thing that struck me was, wait a minute, it sounds like he's giving this command to the man only. Because if you read the very next verse, it says, Yahweh Elohim said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. And so Adam goes into the garden first, alone. He doesn't have Eve or Hawa with him yet. And of course it makes sense that God has to give him this command right away. It's really important that he doesn't eat from the tree. And so I had never really noticed that before. But I think this has deeper spiritual significance. I'm starting to think about it. And if you remember when Eve did eat from the tree, what happens? The serpent in chapter 3 asks her, did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And her answer is, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said you shall not eat of it or touch it lest you die. And now one of the common interpretations I've heard is that Eve had changed God's words by saying that, he said we're not to eat of it or touch it. I don't know, one way or the other. When he tells Adam, he certainly says don't eat from it. There is no command not to touch it. So maybe this is something that she got from Adam. One of the things that happens a lot, especially in Judaism, is you get this idea of building fences around the commandments. And the idea there is noble. If you build the fence around it and you don't break the fence, then of course you're not going to break the commandment. So it helps keep you from breaking the commandments. But our Father did say you should not add or take away from any of these commands. And so it appears as though that's what's happening here. Now, whether it's something that Eve came up with or that Adam came up with when he told her the commandment, I don't know. The scripture doesn't say, but I find it very interesting, especially to think about maybe it was Adam who messed up when he was telling her the command. I mean, it would be pretty typical of mankind to add something extra to it. And it's our duty as believers to correctly share commands with people. We're to spread his word. We're to share his Torah. And we're to talk about the right way to do it. He says he's to be worshipped in spirit and truth. And one of the things that Yeshua did when he was on this earth for a short period of time is provide the correct interpretation. And he really corrected the Pharisees a lot for what they were doing. They really weren't following the Torah in the way it was supposed to be. And a lot of his teachings sought to correct those errors. So we're supposed to teach others about him, and we're supposed to teach others correctly about him. And I think this is one of the reasons why judgment for teachers are a little harsher, because your actions can have consequences that are pretty serious. When God gave the curse, he gave it first to Eve, but he gave it also to Adam because Adam ate. And so he knew the command, and he didn't effectively share the command with Eve, who then ate from the tree and was able to convince her husband to eat from the tree as well. And so it kind of goes back to this idea of circular. Just the whole entire thing was irresponsible and incorrect. And so I want to read something from Ezekiel 34 just to emphasize this idea that, teachers really need to take their job seriously, and their responsibility over the flock seriously, because it can have really serious consequences. So Ezekiel 34, 1 through 10, I'll read. It says, the word of Yahweh came to me, O mortal, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, to the shepherds, thus said Yahweh Elohim, ah, you shepherds of Israel, who have been tending yourselves, is it not the flock that shepherds ought to tend? You partake of the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, and you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not tend the flock. You have not sustained the weak, healed the sick, or bandaged the injured. You have not brought back the strayed, or looked for the lost, but you have driven them with harsh rigor. And they have been scattered, for want of anyone to tend them. Scattered, they have become prey for every wild beast. My sheep stray through all the mountains, and over every lofty hill. My flock is scattered, all over the face of the earth, with none to take thought of them, and none to seek them. Hear then, O shepherds, the word of Yahweh. As I live, declares Yahweh Elohim, because my flock has been a spoil, my flock has been a prey for all the wild beasts, for want of any one to tend them, since my shepherds have not taken thought of my flock. For the shepherds tended themselves instead of tending the flock. Hear indeed, O shepherds, the word of Yahweh. Thus said Yahweh Elohim, I am going to deal with the shepherds. I will demand a reckoning of them for my flock, and I will dismiss them from tending the flock. The shepherds shall not tend themselves any more, for I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it shall not be their prey. Now I find it interesting that some of the things that they were supposed to be doing, healing, taking care of, let's see, where did it go? I lost it. They're supposed to be healing the flock, taking care of it. These are all things that Yeshua taught. I mean, healing was a huge part of his ministry. And so again, this goes back to what I was saying before. Part of showing Torah is showing how to live it in spirit and in truth. It's not just obeying a whole list of rules. You do it from the heart because it's written on your heart. And what that shows outwardly is true love for God and for your fellow man. If you love somebody, you're going to heal them, right? And so along the same lines, I want to go to the New Testament, book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 11 and 12, and it says, And he gave some shlichim, and some prophets, and some preachers, and some shepherds and teachers, for perfecting the set-apart believers, for the work of the ministry, for the edification of the body of the Mashiach. And so again, this just emphasizes how it's our duty to teach, and to share, and to build up one another in the Word. And so we see that Adam in the very beginning failed at this when he failed to correctly share the command with Eve. And even if he's not the one who said don't touch it, and it's something she made up, the fact that she was able to make it up indicates that he didn't correctly share with her what the command was supposed to be and why it was so important. If she was able to misinterpret it or to add something to it herself. Now, the other thing that struck me when I was reading this, though, is I was wondering, well, was Eve onto something? Because when you start reading the clean and the unclean laws in Leviticus and what makes you set apart and sanctified so that you can enter in the presence of God in the tabernacle, is the command not to touch death or carcasses or things unclean, where if you touch a dead carcass, and so remember, the wages of sin is death, and their punishment for eating from the tree was death. And so if you touch dead things, then you're unclean and you're not fit for the presence of God. And so again, I would kind of say this as an answer to some of the people who say, well, the command, he said they would die immediately, and they didn't. But death can be more than just a physical death. And I think in this case, the death would be no longer being able to be in the presence of God. If you remember, he kicked them out of the garden, and the garden is where he walked. And so you couldn't get closer to God than being in the garden. And when they sinned, they no longer were able to be in his presence, which is exactly what happens later in the tabernacle. If you've touched something dead, you're going to be unclean for a period of time, and you're unable to go into the tabernacle and approach the altar. You can read that. I'm not going to read it, but if you want to reference, you can read Leviticus 5:2, Leviticus 11, and Deuteronomy 14. And so moving on, this again is another interesting observation. I want to read from you 2 verses from chapter 3. Doggies. So chapter 3, verse 14, this is when he's giving the serpent his just reward for the sin that he did of deceiving Eve. He says, On your belly you shall crawl, and dirt shall you eat all the days of your life. And just a few verses down, in verse 19, when he's talking to Adam, he says, By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat, until you return to the ground, for from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And, the word here. Oh, the other resource that I like to use is the Strong's Concordance, but I actually have this app on my phone. I do have the physical Strong's Concordance, but there's an app on my phone called My Sword Bible. And it's really easy, really quick. You can just click on the Strong's number, and it will bring you to the word. Hebrew if it's Old Testament, Greek if it's New Testament, and will tell you the definition of that word. And so in this case, in both verse 14, the English word that I have in 14 is dirt, and the English word that I have in 19 is dust. But if you look at the Hebrew, the words are the same. So the Hebrew root is alfar, and that's Strong's number 6083. And I find this interesting because the curse that the serpent gets is that he'll eat dust, but Adam is made of dust. Mankind is made of dust. And so this is exactly what we see today. We're struggling against the enemy, that which would have us turn away from the Father's word. And it says in verse 5 that he's going to put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between her offspring. They shall strike at your head, and you shall strike it at their heel. And so I think this dual usage of the word dust for what the serpent is eating and what the man is made from can teach us a lot. And I'm sure there's a lot that I'm missing spiritually. But it was an interesting observation that I made, and so I wanted to point it out. Again, another dual observation with the similar usage of the same word. In chapter 3, verse 16, when he's talking to the woman about her curse, he says, I will make most severe your pains in childbearing. In pain shall you bear children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And you see almost exactly the same wording in chapter 4, verse 7. This is after Cain and Abel making their offerings. And God doesn't really pay attention to Cain's offering, and so he gets depressed about this. And God's talking to him, and he says, why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there's uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is towards you, yet you can be its master. And so this is the same phraseology, the same structure that we see talking about the woman and her urge being for her husband. And so I wanted to look up and see what this was. And in both verses, the Hebrew word for urge is the same. It's Strong's 8669. Teshuka is the Hebrew word. And the definition could be urge as a desire of a man for a woman, or a desire of a woman for a man. But the other interesting thing that I found is that there's a third potential meaning for this word, and that is of beast to devour. And isn't that certainly describes sin? Sin is a beast that would devour us if it had its way. And so in both cases, you have this secondary phrase which says, he shall rule over you, speaking of the man to the woman, or you can be its master, speaking to Cain about sin. And so I just find that very interesting, that we see this mirror image between the woman's urge for her husband and sin's urge for man. And even though the Hebrew word was the same, the meaning can be really different. Again, I think this is an example where there's something deeper there. And I can remember actually struggling with these two verses several years ago when I lived in Houston. And when I would study the Torah portions with my friends, we found this a couple years ago too. And so I think this is something where the revelation's coming slowly as I do the Torah cycle by cycle every year. Now there's just one more thing that I want to bring up, and this is a verse that has always struck me as really sad. And so the Torah portion ends in chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6, right before the story of Noah and the flood. And what happens is in verse 5, you read it, Yahweh saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And Yahweh regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. And now, this was something that always struck me. It says his heart was saddened. And if you think about, what do you feel when your heart is saddened? It's such this deep level of sadness. And to think that he was so sorry that he created man, that's how strongly he feels about it, just almost makes you want to cry. But I looked into this. I wanted to look up the meaning of the Hebrew words. And I came up with an alternative meaning that, yes, certainly it could be that he is so saddened about this, that he feels it deeply in his soul. But let's just take a look at what the Hebrew words mean. So the word for heart, Strong's 3820, labe, means inner man, mind, will, heart, understanding. Not surprising. But there's 3 other words that it lists that could potentially mean that caught my eye. The first is inclination. Second is resolution, and the third is determination. So this is like you're strong and resolute in a decision, right? And so let's look at the word for saddened. So it's Strong 6087, atsav, and it could mean to be pained, grieved, tortured, and displeased, which is exactly what we would expect. But then other meanings could be to shape, fashion, make, or form. And I found that really interesting because it seems a completely different potential meaning. So if you put together these alternative meanings for heart and saddened, what you could get was that Yahweh's resolution was formed and shaped. In other words, he had made his decision and he wasn't going to go back. And his decision was that he was going to destroy everything that he created. He was going to destroy mankind. Actually, as verse 7 says, men together with beasts, creeping things, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. And so, yes, he is saddened in his heart, but he's also strong and resolute and has made his decision. And so these are just a couple of the tidbits that I brought out that came out to me from the first Torah portion. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to do this every week. No guarantee that every week is going to have as many. It just depends on what comes to me as I'm reading the Torah portion, and I'll share those thoughts. I'll write them down, of course, as I read the portion and look up some of the Hebrew meanings and then share my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Put them in the comments. We can discuss and midrash together. Shalom.